take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the continent to bring you the truth about cannabis and marijuana law reform.
I smoke pot and I like it a lot.
The Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation. Now, here's your host, Radical Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. It is Friday, October 9th, 2015, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. Welcome to the weekend. We made it once again, and what a great weekend it's going to be. I'll be at the Oregon Hemp Convention this weekend at the Portland Expo Center. The Oregon Tattoo Convention is also at the Portland Expo Center, or is it the Portland Tattoo Convention? Regardless, we've got two conventions, weed and tattoos, going on at the Portland Expo Center on Marine Drive. I'll be speaking on Saturday. Got a little address I'll be giving about the success of Oregon's marijuana legalization and the difficulties we still have to work on. Then on Sunday at noon, I will be moderating a panel on cannabis and employment in Oregon. And at 3 o'clock, I will be a part of a panel on marijuana and the media. So looking forward to that. On both panels, I'll be joined by Sid Maurer, the fired Eugene television anchor, and Charlo Green, the Fuck It, I Quit television anchor from Alaska. So we'll have some good times there at the Oregon Hemp Convention. We'll bring you recordings of all the events on next week's shows, so stay tuned for that. Also, podcast listeners let me know that the recording of the podcast for yesterday got messed up, and so I'll be fixing that later today. Get the podcast all updated for everyone for this weekend. Also want to give a shout out to the folks at Doctor's Orders, the pot shop on Southeast 82nd and Gleason. Stopped in there today and got 2 grams of Granddaddy Purple, testing out at 22.75 THC and 0.09 CBD. 2 grams there, and another 2 grams of Gorilla Glue number 4, 25.1% THC hybrid with 0.02% CBD. These were both tested within the past couple of weeks, and the price on those is $10 a gram. I got myself 4 grams and also got myself a nice activist discount, so I promised I'd give them a shout out for being so kind to the activists out there. Their prices for a quarter were going for $55 for the Gorilla Glue, I think it was. That works out to a, $220 ounce, so a little higher than what we're used to, but that's bound to come down over the next few months, absolutely. Now, coming up on today's show, we're going to give you a lesson in U.S. history and cannabis. This was a recording I did in Florida at one of Bobby Platshorn's events, so we'll be playing that for you in the interview segment. Then we'll follow it with a radical rant. Earlier this morning, and I mean way earlier, 6 a.m. my time, I was on a conference call with Dan Riffle from Marijuana Policy Project as we were recording for a segment on another show that's hosted by Sam Tracy, and forgive me for forgetting his co-host's name, but we were discussing Ohio's Issue 3. Dan, of course, is an Ohio native, and he's actually against Issue 3, and I, of course, am one of the most prominent spokespeople for it. So we had a great discussion, and there's just a couple points that were made on that I wanted to elaborate on, given the time in the Radical Rant, so I will. Also on the show, in Drug War Data Mining, we're going to give you a rundown on drug testing for welfare, the cruel waste taking place in 13 of our United States. And the New York Police Department commissioner busts a young woman for smoking a joint on Wall Street. We'll tell you how that turned out. All that's coming out right after the 420 radio news. The headlines are next, right after these messages from our sponsors.
You're tuned into the Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation.
420 Radio, your ticket to the High Times Cannabis Cups.
I know a thing or two about drug dealers. They'll sell anything, anywhere, to anyone. They don't check IDs. They don't care what's in the poison they push. They control the streets. Failing to reform marijuana laws means the drug dealers win. They stay in business, and we surrender our streets. It's time for responsible reform to legalize, regulate, and control marijuana. So we're in charge, not the criminals. Vote yes on 3.
Imagine life without taxes. Let New Era Certified Public Accountants, NewEraCPAs.com, handle your Cannabis 280E and tax strategy. Get your business prepared with New Era CPA's Cannabis Finance Bootcamp. NewEraCPAs.com, with years of experience in the industry, we are one of the nation's leading accounting firms for growers, dispensaries, and ancillary companies from Washington to California. NewEraCPAs.com. It's time for the 420 Radio News, covering the latest headlines in consumer cannabis, medical marijuana, and industrial hemp. Replays of 420 Radio News are embeddable and shareable from our SoundCloud page at soundcloud.com/RadicalRuss. Now, the marijuana headlines in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. This is your 420 Radio News for Friday, October 9th, 2015. A major Republican figure in the Senate has forwarded significant marijuana reform proposals in 3 separate spending bills. Senate Appropriations Committee Chairman Tad Cochran, a Republican from Mississippi, included a section to block the Department of Justice from using any funds to interfere with states that decide to legalize medical marijuana. Another provision keeps the DOJ and Drug Enforcement Administration from cracking down on industrial hemp research programs on the state level. Congress authorized those programs last year. What's new, however, is an attempt to allow physicians at the Department of Veterans Affairs to recommend medical marijuana to veterans. It also prevents the VA from denying services to veterans who choose to take part in medical marijuana programs. Finally, Cochran also included a measure to block the Treasury Department from punishing financial institutions that decide to engage in business with marijuana companies in states where the drug is legal. Though support for full legalization of marijuana in Pennsylvania is down slightly, voters in the state still overwhelmingly support medical marijuana. 90% of Pennsylvania voters favor medical marijuana for patients who have prescribed it to them by a doctor, up from 88% in April, with only 9% registering their disapproval, according to a recent Quinnipiac poll. A whopping 92% of women support medical marijuana, compared with just 7% who were opposed. But only 43% of women said they back full legalization. For men, 87% supported the use of medical marijuana if prescribed by a doctor, while 52% say they were in favor of allowing adults to legally possess small amounts of marijuana for personal use. Overall, Pennsylvania voters are split on full legalization. 49% are against it, while 47% are for it. Oregon would limit serving sizes of marijuana-infused candies, drinks, and other foods in the medical and recreational markets under a set of temporary draft rules released this week. Marijuana-infused edibles would be capped at 5 milligrams of THC per serving in the recreational market. A package of edibles could have no more than 50 milligrams of THC. A chocolate bar, for instance, could have 5 milligram servings, and the whole bar could have no more than 50 milligrams of THC. The draft rules also set serving sizes for edibles produced for the medical marijuana patients. Those products currently face no limits on potency or serving sizes. Under the rules, a cannabis-infused edible produced for medical marijuana patients would have no more than 5 milligrams of THC per serving, for a maximum of 100 milligrams for the whole product. Colorado recently adopted a 10 milligram per serving and 100 milligram per product limit for edibles. A spate of bills that would loosen the prohibition on marijuana in Wyoming will be introduced in the 2016 legislative session, which supporters say signals a growing acceptance of marijuana. A University of Wyoming poll last year showed 72% of the state's residents supported medical marijuana. 60% of Wyomingites surveyed said they opposed marijuana for recreational use. Representative Jim Byrd, a Democrat of Cheyenne, said he will sponsor a bill that would decriminalize small amounts of marijuana. Byrd is also planning to sponsor a medical marijuana reciprocity bill. Out-of-state patients with valid medical marijuana cards traveling through Wyoming would not be arrested for possession of small amounts of marijuana. Byrd also plans to sponsor a bill that would make it illegal to ask on job applications whether a person has been convicted of a crime. Representative Gerald Gay, a Republican of Casper, said he will introduce his bill that would allow cannabidiol, the non-psychoactive component of marijuana, to be used as medicine. An Australian family who traveled to Canada in order to legally access cannabis oil treatment could soon be forced to return home, where the life-changing medication is outlawed. Tabitha and Georgia Grace Fulton, age 13 and 8, both suffer from a degenerative lung disease so rare that it doesn't have a name. Their mother, Bobby Jo, brought the girls to Victoria, British Columbia so they could access the cannabis oil treatment after a successful and illegal 12-week trial in Australia. The health benefits from taking cannabis oil were astounding, the girls say. They went from taking heavy doses of steroids and being unable to stay awake for more than 45 minutes to being able to walk around all day without oxygen tanks. But their 6-month stay in Canada is nearing an end as their visa limits expire. This has been your 420 Radio News for Friday, October 9th, 2015. I'm Russ Belville.
Warning. Hits taken on this show are larger than they appear. Do not try this at home. These people are professionals. Or at least they pay me to say that.
The Russ Belville Show is proudly sponsored by the Marijuana Business Association. The MJBA, called by NBC News the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce, is the fastest growing business association in the fastest growing industry in America. I've been working with the MJBA for years, and I personally invite you to join the MJBA. MJBA also publishes the popular MJ Headline News on Facebook and the MJNewsNetwork.com and Marijuana Channel 1 on YouTube. Visit mjba.net for more details. Oregon has joined Washington and Colorado in legalizing marijuana. We're Portland NORML, the national organization for the reform of marijuana laws chapter in Portland, Oregon. Join us as we celebrate the launch of an exciting new era in marijuana freedom in Oregon. Our job has just begun. Powerful interests want to white out the most important portions of Oregon's legalization law. By joining Portland NORML, you add your voice to the thousands who voted for Measure 91 and want it to be implemented as written. The people have spoken. Now it is time for the legislature to obey the will of the people. Find out more about Portland NORML at portlandnormal.org. Attend our monthly membership meetings on the fourth Saturday of the month. See our website for more details. Portland NORML, ensuring responsible adult marijuana consumers are afforded the same rights, privileges, and responsibilities as beer drinkers. Today in Behind the Headlines, we go to New York City, where the police commissioner, Bill Bratton, ran into a woman smoking pot on the street. He told the story at the New York Law School breakfast, where he was discussing his crime-fighting strategies, and he explained, quote, "The streets were packed with people, as they always are on Wall Street, and all of a sudden, there it is, that smell. I said, 'What the hell? It's 8:30 in the morning on Wall Street.'" End quote. At first, Bratton and his bodyguard couldn't figure out where the pungent aroma was coming from. He continued, quote, "I'm looking around and we come up to a red light, a pedestrian light that you can't cross. Directly in front of me is this young woman, happily puffing away. She's got her earphones in and a school bag on her way to one of the local schools." The woman was oblivious at that point. "And so my security officer came up on one side. I came up on the other and tapped her on the shoulder, and she looked over. I wish I had a photograph of that face because she instantly recognized me." End quote. It was at that point where Commissioner Bratton and his security bodyguard threw the woman to the ground, gave her a serious stop and frisk, patted her down to make sure she wasn't carrying any weapons, investigated to see if she had anything in her mouth, handcuffed her with her hands behind her back, and left her there while they rifled through her book bag and trying to ask her a bunch of questions to see if she was committing any other crimes. And since the public display of marijuana was in effect, the decriminalization in the state was null and void because public display is a misdemeanor in New York City. So that's when Bratton and his bodyguard threw her into the back of a squad car where she was taken to Rikers for processing and left there at Rikers for 2 days as she was unable to raise bail. She ended up flunking out of school and having difficulty getting jobs for the rest of her life because she was a convicted drug criminal. Oh, no, excuse me. I'm sorry. I misread that. No. Bratton says, quote, "We politely removed the marijuana, threw it into the local sewer, and suggested that she might have a better academic day without the influence of pot." End quote. Yeah, so being a little sarcastic here because there are 30,000 marijuana arrests in New York City to this day, even after Bratton has tackled the idea of the stop and frisk of anybody who's caught walking while black in a poor neighborhood. Even after that, we still have 30,000 arrests a year that are mostly indications of trying to keep a certain segment of the population down. And if this had not been a young white woman on Wall Street, if this had been a young black man up above 110th Street, then yeah, the story that I described to you would probably be how that went down. Now, Bratton told his audience, quote, "If you're smoking it in public, we will potentially arrest you. But we encourage officers to use the scale they are authorized to use. Warning, admonitions, summons, arrest if necessary." Yeah, that scale, though, only seems to exist for more upper class and lighter skinned people in the midtown or downtown areas of New York, and not so much for the people of color, again, up in the upper areas and the poorer areas of New York. New York City still remains the marijuana arrest capital of the United States, with more arrests taking place there than any other city. And that's in a state where marijuana is decriminalized and there's allegedly medical marijuana in that state. So, Bill Bratton, your funny little anecdote being told to the folks at the New York Law School just re-emphasizes the cruelty and the disproportionately racist nature of the enforcement policies of the NYPD. We know how this story goes down for far, far too many people in the city that aren't little white girls trying to go to school around the Wall Street area. And of course, we know also how the cops, the NYPD, have routinely tricked so many people into committing those offenses that can be arrested for. Because as I said, it's decriminalized in New York State. So long as that marijuana is in your pocket, you can only get a ticket. But the NYPD has been taught to scare these kids into taking the weed out of their pockets, thereby putting it into public view, which is an arrestable misdemeanor offense in the state of New York. The misdemeanor offense that young lady was committing and somehow was able to get away with it right in front of the top cop of the New York Police Department.
Grab-a-dab-a-goo!
Well, we can't grab a dab of goo yet, Dan. We recreational consumers can only purchase up to 7 grams of flour per day. That'll change soon enough. Sometime next summer, we'll get our pot shops where we get edibles and tinctures, but I'll tell you, a pretty stupid idea to want to limit them to 5 milligram servings. Oh, Maureen Dowd. Be right back.
The Russ Belville Show, the National Wildlife Refuge for marijuana unicorns.
As a police officer, I walked the beat, served on the Vice Squad and SWAT team, and became an expert on drug addiction. I saw firsthand the effects of Ohio's destructive marijuana laws. Simply put, they don't work. Ohio spends over $100 million each year on this failed effort. It's time for marijuana reform, so law enforcement can spend their time cracking down on real criminals and making Ohio a safer place for our families. Vote yes on 3.
The Fingerboard extension has fretted instruments to enhance your creativity. It has new and used guitars and banjos from beginning to high class. The Fingerboard extension has National Resophonic, Husson Dalton, Larrabee, Heritage and Recording King guitars, and Mike Ramsey, Wildwood, Gold Tone, and Recording King banjos. The Fingerboard extension also has drum stuff, used gear, and parts. Stop by the Fingerboard extension, downtown Corvallis, Oregon at 120 Northwest 2nd, or check out the inventory on the web at fingerboardextension.com and reverb.com. Arguing for the end of adult marijuana prohibition is easy because we have facts, science, reason, compassion, evidence, truth, and logic on our side. It is even easier when researchers catalog it all for us. Learn how to gather the facts on marijuana use, arrests, seizures, rehabs, drug tests, and more in this edition of Drug War Data Mining. Yet another state shows pathetic results from drug testing for welfare. The data are in from the first year of drug testing people applying for welfare benefits in Tennessee, and like every other state that pursues this policy, they only ended up wasting money and catching a tiny fraction of those applicants with a failed drug test. This all started with Florida. They pioneered this cruel idea by requiring that all people applying for welfare had to take a drug test. The applicant would pay for this test to be reimbursed later if the applicant passed the test. During the 4 months it was in operation, the program tested 4,086 applicants. Of those, 108 tested positive. That's a positive rate of 2.6%. The national rate of drug use is 9.4%. That program cost taxpayers of Florida $118,140, or well over $1,000 per positive test. When researchers examined the results of the Florida program, they found, quote, the procedures employed by the state of Florida did not produce reliable estimates of the level of drug use among welfare beneficiaries, end quote. It also cost Florida about $1.5 million in legal fees when it lost the resulting lawsuits over the program. The federal courts invalidated the welfare drug testing requirement for not requiring any reasonable suspicion that a poor person applying for welfare is a drug abuser. Searching every person applying for welfare, the courts decided, was an unconstitutional breach of the Fourth Amendment rights that even poor people still have. So, the states that have followed Florida in punishing poor people over unreal stereotypes have added a wrinkle to their scheme. While applying for welfare, applicants answer questions in a small quiz designed to root out those who might be drug users, thus providing the reasonable suspicion needed to pass constitutional muster. In Tennessee, the questions asked are, have you used illegal drugs before? Have you lost or been denied a job because of drug use? Have you had any scheduled court appearances in the past 3 months related to drug use? Of the 28,559 people asked those questions in Tennessee, only 468 of them answered yes to any of them, and therefore were tested. That's a rate of 1.6%. Which surely must mean some of these people are lying, since the general rate of drug use in America is 9.4%, and the lifetime use of any drug in America is above half. So the question, have you used illegal drugs before? At least half the people can answer yes to that. Even if poor people don't use drugs as much as the general population, because drugs cost money, there's no way the rate is as low as 1.6%. And then, out of the 468 people they tested, only 55 came up positive for any drug. That's a rate of almost 12% among those tested, but a rate of 0.19% among all welfare applicants. Nabbing these 55 people cost Tennessee $11,000 in testing, which works out to $200 per applicant caught. Defenders of these laws will claim that we can't criticize the low rates of the failed tests because the tests themselves deter drug users from applying in the first place, thus saving the state money. They'll also claim that the cost of catching the one drug user is supplanted by the savings in not providing welfare to that person. Well, it's difficult to prove the first claim. There are many factors that influence the rate of applications for welfare. As the economy improves and people get jobs, the welfare rolls decrease. It's hard to accept that the 3-quiz questionnaire is dissuading many people from applying when only 1.6% are caught by it and only 0.19% are actually deterred. Now, the second claim may be true in some cases, but the average benefit per family per month on welfare in Tennessee is only about $164. Regardless, think about what success is defined as here. Denying welfare to a poor person in need. Are we supposed to celebrate that a poor person and their kids may go hungry and sleep in the streets because some drug test identified her as someone who smoked pot at some recent time in the past? What is the eventual cost of the emergency services they'll need? Will they exceed that $200 we spent on denying them $164? The push for drug testing for welfare is nothing more than grandstanding politicians looking for ways to seem tough on government spending while demonizing the poor and drug users. The idea seems to be that we taxpayers shouldn't subsidize a poor person's drug habit. Yet nobody proposes testing welfare recipients for their alcohol and tobacco use. And given that most of the people failing drug tests are bound to be failing for marijuana, this amounts to ferreting out the poor who will cost society the least while incentivizing them to use the legal drugs that will cost society more. It's somewhat hypocritical as well, when many of these politicians grandstand all the time about getting big government out of our lives. Apparently, though, if you're a poor person in need of assistance, big government owns your life and can dictate what you do with it. Witness the recent attempts in Wisconsin to ban food stamp recipients from buying shellfish, pickles, and sharp cheddar cheese. In Missouri, to ban the purchase of cookies, soft drink, and steak with food benefits. And in Kansas, to ban withdrawal of more than $25 cash, going to the movies, or spending welfare money anywhere minors aren't allowed. And it's highly selective. Nobody's proposing any rich beneficiaries of government welfare to pee in a cup. You don't see the CEOs of Boeing or General Electric being quizzed about their drug history for the billions in subsidies and tax breaks they get from the government. Whether or not some white-collar executive receiving billions in welfare enjoys some white powder isn't a concern. But the pot use of a single mom receiving $164 to help pay the rent requires our diligent attention. I tell you, I get tired of having to tell that story. If freedom means anything in this country, it means we have the freedom to rule our lives and to do with them what we choose. If welfare is a ticket for us to be able to control other people's lives, let's just call it what it is. Babysitting or slavery or indentured servitude or whatever you want to call it. But it ain't freedom. We'll be back with a lesson on U.S. history and cannabis recorded in Florida. I'm Radical Russ. Stay tuned for these messages from our sponsors.
You're tuned into the Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation. The Russ Belville Show, where we don't change our position on decriminalization in an election year.
At Herbie's Cannabis Seeds, we pride ourselves on bringing you the best quality seeds from the world's most respected cannabis seed producers, all at the lowest online prices. You can find Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. All cannabis seeds are sold as souvenirs and as a means of preserving cannabis genetics. Herbie's Seeds in no way intends to condone, promote, or incite the use of illegal or controlled substances. We strongly urge all prospective customers to check their national laws prior to placing an order. Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. Proud sponsors of the Russ Belville Show and 420 Radio. Hey everybody, it's Radical Russ here from 420 Radio, inviting you to be like me and get your ink done at Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo, Fort Worth's most female-friendly, clean, sterile, awesome tattoo shop. Thomas and his crew are true artists who can design you a custom piece or use a design you bring in. Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo also offers all styles of tattooing as well as piercings and all-around fun. In the DFW area, stop by Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo and tell them Radical Russ sent you. Trust me, it'll feel awesome. Hi there, my name's Russ Belville from The Russ Belville Show. Today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the evolution of the marijuana issue itself, a little look at the history. Oftentimes we're hit with the line that we shouldn't legalize a third drug. There shouldn't be a third legal drug. We shouldn't introduce marijuana into American culture. And I find this to be quite ironic, since American culture has featured marijuana in it in one way or another since its founding. We can start all the way back to the very founding of the first colonies here in North America. The Jamestown colony in 1611 was the first place where the English settlers began planting hemp. And so we can look back to industrial hemp in this country as over 400 years worth of history of industrial hemp. Throughout colonial times and leading up to the Industrial Revolution, hemp was a major cash crop for the colonies and a major reason why the British were utilizing the colonies for their farming of hemp that was so valuable for the sailing industry. The British Navy, being the largest navy in the world at the time, needed the ropes and the sailing and the rigging and everything that you would make from industrial hemp. Hemp turned out to be a far superior crop for rope and all of the things that needed to be used at sea, since it is resistant to rot and mildew and very high tensile strength and so forth. So it was a very important cash crop, so important that the American colonists in Virginia and other colonies could actually pay their taxes in hemp, and some of them were even required by law to grow hemp. So this is nothing new in America when we talk about the hemp crop. Just quick note, hemp and cannabis, both the same plant, basically, same family of plant, but hemp is the crop that is kind of a cousin. It's non-psychoactive. It doesn't get you high in any sort of way. It's just an industrial crop. But also we have cannabis, which is the medicinal flowering tops that we often call marijuana in this country, but everywhere else in the world they call it cannabis. Cannabis had been known throughout human history. We can go back 7,000 years on this if we really want to. But as far as American use goes, it was incidental here and there, used somewhat for pain and aches and so forth. There's some theory as to George Washington perhaps using it for the tooth problems that he had, the teeth problems that he legendarily had. 1850, about the mid-1800s. In Britain, there was a doctor named O'Shaughnessy, and he went to India and was studying how the people of India were still using bhang, B-H-A-N-G, which is their preparation, a liquid preparation they make from cannabis plants, and they were using it medicinally. And he started to classify, and study what they were using in India, brought that knowledge back to England. Through England, it made its way back to the States, and by the 1850s, cannabis had been entered into the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, the official listing of medical drugs in the United States. But as we round the turn of the 20th century and we get into the early 1900s, we start to see the first anti-drug acts in America. Much of this was brought about by racism. Particularly the first anti-drug act was the Harrison Anti-Narcotics Act that banned opium. But particularly, it didn't particularly ban opium, it banned opium dens. And it didn't particularly ban opium dens, it particularly banned Chinese people running opium dens. So there was a huge element of racism involved in that. Cannabis was seen as something that was used by the Mexican immigrants as they were coming in to the American Southwest. The first anti-cannabis laws were passed in El Paso, Texas to combat this. A lot of it was, we can't harass or lock these people up simply for being brown, but we can harass and lock them up for the joints they're smoking. So that's became the tool of oppressing, the Mexican immigrants. Also, if you look in the Delta area of the United States, Louisiana and such, you had the jazz musicians. You had your, Louis Armstrong and King Oliver and so forth that were using cannabis, and that was seen as another, those people's drug. So the demonization of cannabis was just set to begin against the blacks and the Latinos that were using it. They found that they couldn't oppose cannabis because everybody knew what cannabis was. It was that what you got in the bottle that was a medicine. And you couldn't oppose hemp because everyone knew what that was. So they appropriated the Mexican slang term marijuana and used that to describe cannabis. And to the general public, and this is, of course, pre-internet, mass communication, they had no idea when they were talking about banning marijuana that was the cannabis hemp that everybody loved and knew. So they were able to gain public support for the banning of this Mexican marijuana. First in Massachusetts in 1911, California in 1913. By the time 1937 rolls around and the federal government gets around to banning it, it had already been banned in all 48 of the existing states at that time. So federal prohibition really followed behind the states. The states started it. The federal prohibition came about in 1937, and when it was debated in Congress, on the first day of debates, a member of the American Medical Association was called to testify, and he told Congress not to ban cannabis. It's an important medicine. Don't ban it. The next day in hearings, they asked, before they took the vote, did the AMA come and testify on this? And another congressman lied and said, yes, they did, and they said we should ban it. So the whole ban on marijuana started with a lie and started against the wishes of the medical establishment. Since 1937 and the banning of marijuana, hemp got lumped into that as well, until World War II broke out. So about 4 years later, World War II breaks out, and we have all these ships we need to send across the Pacific, and the Japanese had cut off our supply of hemp from the Philippines. There was no place to get hemp, so they put a temporary stop on that ban and created what was called the Hemp for Victory program. And from 1941 all the way through, and the last farm to shut down was in 1957. So we actually had a period in American history where hemp was being grown, once again, to supply the war effort, to supply the rigging for ships and the not sails this time, but rigging and canvas and so forth. Then we, of course, have the 50s and the beat poets and the beatnik movement that starts to rediscover the drug aspect of cannabis. That flowers into, of course, the 60s and the anti-Vietnam War movement and the flower power and the hippies and the love, all of that stuff that was going on, a summer of love and so forth. But there was one very interesting catch in the Marijuana Tax Act that it took 30 years before someone figured this out. The Marijuana Tax Act, the way it was written, it did not ban marijuana. You could grow marijuana, you could have marijuana, but the only way you could is if you had a marijuana tax stamp. And the only way to get a marijuana tax stamp was to take your marijuana into the tax office and have it weighed and get your stamp. Problem is, when you walked into the tax office with unstamped marijuana, you were breaking federal law because you couldn't have marijuana without a tax stamp. So while it wasn't technically banned, it was effectively banned because nobody could get the tax stamp without breaking the law. It was 30 some odd years later when Timothy Leary, the Harvard professor and PhD who was behind the tune in, turn on, drop out, LSD kind of movement, that's where most people know Timothy Leary from. But Timothy Leary also was the man who sued the United States government over the Marijuana Tax Act. And his point was that having to bring in untaxed marijuana is incriminating yourself of a crime in order to try to follow a law. And that violates the Fifth Amendment. We can't be called on to violate, to self-incriminate just to follow a law. The Supreme Court agreed and overturned the Marijuana Tax Act. And so for a brief moment in time, marijuana was once again not banned. But it was a very brief moment in time because Richard Nixon was in power at the time and was not about to sit there and let the Vietnam War protesters and the hippies have their legal weed. So by 1970, he railroaded through Congress what is known as the Controlled Substances Act that divides drugs into 5 schedules or categories, 5 being the least harmful and 1 being absolutely illegal, most harmful drugs. And that's the schedule that marijuana sits in today with LSD, heroin, PCP, mushrooms, and so on. First in 1961, the Single Convention Treaty, that was ratified and amended in 1978, I think. But basically that was the United States pulling the rest of the world into our ban of cannabis and into our drug war. And now most of the world is signatories to that treaty as well. So we've languished under this Controlled Substances Act through the 70s. In the 1970s, the first step at trying to reform this was decriminalization. Because of the Controlled Substances Act and the treaties that we're under, you cannot legalize marijuana. In fact, there's some question right now as to Washington and Colorado having legalized marijuana. Does that put the United States in violation of those UN treaties? Hasn't been resolved yet, but that's a possibility. And then, of course, we had the late 70s where there were some high-profile problems with cocaine happening. We had the Studio 54 era. We started to get into the 1980s with the whole Miami Vice era and the big cocaine era, and some high-profile deaths and injuries, including Richard Pryor, John Belushi, Len Bias. And at the time, cocaine and marijuana were kind of tied together. They were like equal party drugs. You know, both of them were thought of as no big deal. In fact, if you go back to High Times magazine from 1978 through 1981, you can actually find covers and centerfolds of lines of cocaine right there with the buds of marijuana. They're seen as very equal, socially speaking. As the 80s come to an end and the 90s begin, we get the election of Bill Clinton, who famously said,
"I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it, and didn't inhale, and never tried it again."
And from that point, marijuana begins to get a resurgence in the public mind. A kind of maybe people are reacting saying, well, gosh, if a guy can become president after smoking weed, maybe it's not so bad. So AIDS activists from the Bay Area started lobbying to get marijuana included in what was called the Compassionate Investigative New Drug Program. This was a program that was started back in the 70s. Actually, I think it's older than that. And what it's for is, you know, if we discovered a new plant or a new chemical and we thought it might have medical benefit, we could have a test of it, let's say, you know, a trial. So this Compassionate Investigative New Drug Program was sued in 1978 by a man named Robert Randall, who was a glaucoma patient, who sued the government saying, look, I have to use marijuana because if I don't, I'll go blind. Kind of a medical necessity defense. And the government agreed, or the courts agreed, that he had this medical necessity to use marijuana. The government was afraid that other people would figure that out and, you know, start suing and everybody be using marijuana. So they created this Compassionate Investigative New Drug Program. And soon enough, more people began suing to get on that program, including our friend Irv Rosenfeld behind us in '82, I think it was, who got on for his rare skeletal disorder that he has. So to this date, we still have actually 2 living patients that are using medical cannabis supplied by the government under this program that's been in existence since 1978. As the AIDS patients started to sue the government to get on this Compassionate Investigative New Drug Program, President George H.W. Bush shut it down. It was one of the last things he did as he was leaving office in 1992. He shut down or closed that program to any new entrants. So you got to think how terribly cruel that was to turn to all the AIDS patients of the early 90s and say, no, this door is closed to you. And that's exactly what happened. But they rebounded and started fighting for it at the state level. And in California, they began to fight for what we now know as medical marijuana. This idea that a state would not punish. And again, this doesn't legalize anything. It's not legalizing marijuana. Marijuana is still illegal, but it's a state saying we won't prosecute people if they're using it medically. California passed that in 1996 with the Compassionate Use Act, and since then we've had 22 states that have followed in some level, some regard. No state has passed a medical marijuana law as inclusive as California's since then, but we have had 22 states that have passed some form of medical marijuana since then. So the medical marijuana movement continues through the 90s and into the 2000s, and now where we find ourselves in the 2010s, we've got, in 2010, California tried to pass Proposition 19, a legalization ballot initiative that did not pass. But in the following election, 2012, we had Oregon, Washington, and Colorado try to pass legalization, with Washington and Colorado succeeding. So that's where we find ourselves in the history of marijuana from the founding of this country all the way to the modern day. I'm Radical Russ Belville from The Russ Belville Show on 420radio.org. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, Take care of each other, tokers.
All right, had a great time doing that segment down there in Florida. And that's now a video that's available, and it's called Cannabis in America. Cannabis in Modern America. So you can check that out on YouTube if you want to see the video version. We're going to take a break and bring you the anti-drug public service announcement of the day. And then at the end of the show, time for a radical rant. I'll tell you all about my discussion with Sam Tracy, Rochelle Young, and Dan Riffle for an edition of This Week in Drugs. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
You're tuned into the Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation. This is the Russ Belville Show.
You know Herb Thrasher from the Herb Thrasher Flower Hour. Now get ready for Herb Age Designs for the proud cannabis consumer. Herb Age Designs, lifestyle gear for the 420 friendly. Herb Age Designs, we've got Frisbee golf discs and durable hemp gear. Herb Age Designs, we've got shot glasses, drinking glasses, coffee mugs, and beer cozies. Check us out on Facebook and online at herbagedesigns.com. And follow Herb Age and Herb Thrasher on Twitter. In the interest of fair and balanced journalism, the Russ Belville Show presents the anti-drug public service announcement of the day.
You missed the bus or something?
Yeah, you're dumb.
Do you have your homework?
Let me check real quick.
You're a joke.
This has been the anti-drug public service announcement of the day. To cure this sort of reefer madness, listen to the Russ Belville Show every weekday on 420radio.org.
420 Radio is brought to you by Sacred Serum, who is focused on creating elegant and sophisticated cannabis solutions through its line of dispensers and vaporizers that come preloaded with the world's finest cannabis concentrate. Sacred Serum's concentrate is made on pharmaceutical-grade supercritical CO2 extraction machines that use absolutely no butane or other toxic chemicals. The Vesica, the company's innovative new way to dab and frost, is now available in dispensaries across California. Sacred Serum, elegance and sophistication concentrated.
420 Radio, turning red states and blue states green.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
That marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug.
Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room.
I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it and didn't inhale.
And one major responsibility is to encourage people to use less drugs.
Entirely legitimate topic for debate.
Radical Rant. All right, welcome back, everybody. I was up very early this morning, 6 a.m. Pacific time, to be a part of a discussion on This Week in Drugs, hosted by Sam Tracy and Rochelle Young. They're both alumnus of the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, alumni, I guess they'd be, right? They're alumni of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Sorry, when I mess up Latin, I always laugh because I think of that scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian with the graffiti artist. I digress. I was on with Sam Tracy and Rochelle Young, and the other guest on the show was Dan Riffle of the Marijuana Policy Project. And if you follow my Twitter feed, you know that I've gone rounds with Dan on a few things with regard to, well, not just Ohio, but lately it's been Ohio. And it's an interesting pair for them to have on. Dan is a very straight-laced, sober ex-prosecutor from Ohio who does not smoke marijuana. Okay, so he's representing the no side. And to be clear, he wasn't representing Marijuana Policy Project in that respect. MPP is neutral, but representing his own views. And he urges a no vote on the issue 3 legalization that will be voted on in 32 days in the state of Ohio. And I, of course, am the professional pothead radio host in Oregon that already has free market legalization, who is urging Ohioans to vote yes on issue 3 marijuana legalization. And it was a good discussion, very professional, and I have the utmost respect for Dan Riffle, the work he's done, and he's been on numerous shows. He's debated the Joker, Kevin Sabet, multiple times on TV, right? So, you know, my hat's off to him as far as all that goes. He's a stalwart defender of liberty and opponent of ignorance in the face of Kevin Sabet, of course. But it got to one point in our discussion where, and I believe it was Sam who brought up this notion that, you know, the debate in Ohio's issue 3 has divided a lot of drug reformers who'd normally be for legalization, but now they're saying vote no on issue 3, like Dan. And the point was brought up that, and I don't remember who said it, was something like, I wish, or it would be great if, I can't remember how it was phrased, but the point was about calling people who normally support legalization, who are voting no, calling them prohibitionists and how that's a bad thing and we should be above that or whatever. And of course, I had to object because at that moment, I kind of felt like Donald Trump at that first GOP debate, when the very first question out of the gate was, would you sign a pledge saying you wouldn't be an independent? It's like, supposedly for the whole audience, but we all know who it was about. I kind of felt like that. It's like, okay, so they're calling me out on calling people prohibitionists. I did not flinch from that description. And I explained it somewhat like this. I'm a daily pot smoker, and it's more than just something I like and something that's every now and then with friends or whatever. This is a part of my life. It's a part of who I am. And so in 1971, my government, my president, declared war on me. Declared that I was public enemy number 1. And since that day, the forces of local, county, state, and federal authorities have been empowered to take my liberty, my stuff, my freedom, my career, my children, if I had any, my gun rights, empowered to take all of that because of who I am. Not necessarily because pot's illegal. To me, it's indistinguishable. Pot is who I am. So if pot is illegal, I'm illegal. So I take it very seriously when a war is declared on me. And when that war is declared, it's important to understand who the enemies in that war are. And to me, they are the cops and the prosecutors and the rehabs and the drug testers and the prison guards and the probation officers and the parole officers and all of the entire prison industrial complex that keeps grinding on, not to mention pharmaceuticals, that keeps grinding on based on processing my people, on oppressing my people. They're my enemy. Those guys are the enemy in the war on drugs, not some rich landowners. Rich landowners who are already rich and will continue to be rich, and they'll find something else that'll make them rich. They'll be rich. I'm not concerned with them. So to me, this is a war, and the war is about ending prohibition. If you're on the side of the war that's voting to maintain prohibition, you are by definition a prohibitionist. Now, what your heart says inside about how you feel about how marijuana should be treated is irrelevant. The result on the ballot box is a shot fired in that war for our side or for the enemy's side. In World War II, maybe the Japanese who were shooting at my grandfather really liked Americans and thought that war was the wrong way to engage with us, but was just following orders. That wouldn't matter much if my grandfather had been hit by his bullets. This is a war, and if you give aid and comfort to the enemy, you are a traitor in that war. That's not to say that you haven't done great work in the past, that you haven't fought for legalization at every turn. It's not to say that you won't fight for legalization in the future, but for this battle, this campaign, this legalization issue, on November 3rd, 2015, you're with us or you're against us. It's as simple as that. And that was a major part of our discussion. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate my feelings on that because I keep going rounds with people on Twitter about this. And it's just mind-boggling to me that someone would think that we can just wait. That was the guy. I was a 24-year-old guy with a business degree who wants to get into he's been wanting to get into this industry since he was 18. Oh my goodness, my young man, a whole 6 years you've been waiting. So wants to get in this so bad, but says he can wait till something better comes along because there's no way some rich 1%er who knows nothing about marijuana is going to pay him better than the money he's already making. And the only thing I hear when I'm reading that is, I'm pretty well to do. I'm not likely to get busted for marijuana, so who cares if a few epileptic kids die until we can get a better business plan? Because there's not just people, and this is what I close with them, is they said, what would you like to tell the voters of Ohio? Is vote like your mom's life depended on it. Because somebody's mom's life depends on this. Somebody's child's life depends on this. This isn't just about some college kids not getting a $150 ticket. Although it is also about that. This is about life and death for some people. And to treat it so cavalier, to dismiss, I mean, I made the point also that, well, gosh, if this decrim is so no big deal, because Dan pointed out, well, I used to be a prosecutor. If you had less than 100 plants, nothing really bad happened to you. Yeah, aside from the arrest and going to court and hiring the lawyer and being scared to death and, possibly losing your job throughout the process. Other than that, everything was fine. And if this decrim is so great and it's not such a big deal that we don't need to legalize now, why do we ever need to legalize? We'll talk more about this in Hour 2. Podcast listeners, thanks for joining us. Live listeners, stay tuned. Hour 2 Toker Talk Radio is coming up next. From beautiful legal Potland, Oregon's Rolla J Studios, I'm Radical Russ Belville. Until next time, take care of each other, Tokers. And tune in tonight, 8 p.m., Herb Thrasher Flower Hour Live.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
I'm Corey Menken with the ASPCA, asking you to join our